3 true scary stories from police officers, creepy cases, and unsolved mysteries. The camera pans over a dimly lit room adorned with old case files, faded photographs, and the cluttered memorabilia of a long career in law enforcement. Sitting at the table, a retired detective leans forward, his hands clasped tightly together. His face, lined with years of experience and etched with the weight of secrets, is illuminated by a single desk lamp. The soft hum of a tape recorder punctuates the silence. He begins to speak, his voice steady yet reflective, carrying the weight of stories that have haunted him for decades. There are cases that define your career and your soul, he says, his gaze distant, as if staring into the past. These are mine. The town of Elmswood in the late 1990s was small enough for everyone to know everyone, but big enough to harbor secrets. Nestled in the Midwest, its picturesque streets and tight-knit community masked a simmering undercurrent of political maneuvering and hidden agendas. The local police department mirrored the town's dichotomy. Officers who lived for the camaraderie of the badge, yet constantly navigated the fraught waters of hierarchy and suspicion. The late 1990s was a time when technology was beginning to infiltrate law enforcement, but not fast enough to replace traditional detective work. DNA testing was in its infancy, databases were rudimentary, and the internet was a novelty rather than a tool. Policing relied on gut instincts, careful observation, and the delicate balance of trust between colleagues. In Elmswood, this trust was both a lifeline and a double-edged sword. The department had a reputation for loyalty, a code that extended beyond the law itself. Officers protected one another, sometimes at the expense of transparency. It was a fraternity bound by unspoken rules, but these bonds often blurred the line between justice and self-preservation. The detective shifts in his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he recalls the environment that shaped his career. Back then, the job wasn't just about solving crimes. It was about navigating a system that demanded loyalty above all else. The stories he recounts are not just about the crimes themselves, but the people involved. The suspects, the victims, the colleagues, all interconnected in a web of decisions that tested the boundaries of morality. Each case forced him to confront the cost of truth, the weight of loyalty, and the uneasy compromises that define survival in his line of work. The detective's narrative unveils a town grappling with its own identity. Beneath the surface of neighborly barbecues and PDA meetings lay a complex network of secrets. Elmswood's power players, politicians, business leaders, and even some officers operated behind closed doors, ensuring that not all truths came to light. You could solve a case and still lose, he says, his voice tinged with regret. Sometimes the answers you find only raise more questions about the people you work with, about the choices you make, and about yourself. As he takes a long breath, the weight of the memories pressing on him, the recorder captures the essence of his journey. It is not just the crimes, but the moral dilemmas they entailed that linger in his mind. This is not merely a chronicle of criminal acts. It is a study of human nature, the price of loyalty, and the pursuit of justice in a world where truth is rarely black and white. Story 1. The Vanishing Officer. Officer Greg Harlan was the kind of cop people trusted instinctively. With his easy smile and reputation for solving cases that baffled others, he was a fixture in the Elmswood Police Department. Greg had served for over a decade, earning not just accolades, but genuine camaraderie from his colleagues. For a town as small and close-knit as Elmswood, Greg Harlan was more than an officer. He was a symbol of integrity. So, when he failed to report for his shift one Tuesday morning, it wasn't just unusual, it was shocking. At first, his colleagues assumed it was a mix-up. Greg was meticulous, but everyone made mistakes. When calls to his house went unanswered, concern turned to alarm. By midday, Chief Avery had ordered a welfare check at Greg's home. His car was parked in the driveway, his front door locked, and his house eerily quiet. Inside, everything was in order. No signs of a struggle, no indication that Greg had planned to leave town. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, next to a newspaper folded open to the crossword puzzle. The scene was unremarkable, save for one glaring detail. Greg was nowhere to be found. That afternoon, the department pulled Greg's last known movements from traffic cameras and surveillance feeds across town. The breakthrough came from a grainy recording outside an old warehouse on the outskirts of Elmswood. At 11:47 p.m. the previous night, Greg's cruiser pulled into the warehouse's parking lot. He stepped out, flashlight in hand, and entered the building. And then nothing. The footage showed no one else entering or leaving the warehouse for hours afterward. Greg Harlan had vanished into thin air. The warehouse, a sprawling relic of Elmswood's industrial past, had been abandoned for years. Once a hub for manufacturing farm equipment, it now stood as a decaying monument to economic decline. Broken windows, rusted machinery, and graffiti-covered walls gave the place an air of desolation. The site was notorious for being a hangout for vagrants and an occasional scene for petty crimes, but nothing serious enough to warrant Greg's attention, or so it seemed. The next morning, a team of officers, led by Detective Claire Mason, was dispatched to the warehouse. Claire, known for her methodical approach, had worked closely with Greg on numerous cases. She found herself grappling with the surreal nature of the situation. Inside the warehouse, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of oil and decay. Officers combed through the building, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. They found Greg's flashlight lying near the entrance, its bulb shattered. Nearby, a dark stain marked the concrete floor, but it wasn't blood. Further in, they discovered a cluster of papers scattered near an old desk, but nothing that provided immediate answers. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of a crime scene, just an overwhelming emptiness. What was he doing here? Claire muttered to herself as she examined the scene. Greg wasn't reckless. He wouldn't have gone in alone unless he had a good reason. As the hours turned into days, the theories began to pile up. Some officers suggested Greg might have been ambushed, lured to the warehouse by someone who knew his patterns. Others whispered darker possibilities. Perhaps Greg had been involved in something illicit and decided to disappear before it caught up with him. Public pressure mounted as news of Greg's disappearance spread. Elmswood's residents were both horrified and desperate for answers. Local news stations ran endless coverage, speculating wildly about what could have happened. Chief Avery held press conferences, urging calm and promising that the department would leave no stone unturned. Behind the scenes, however, the department was in chaos. The lack of evidence made every officer a suspect in someone's eyes. Accusations flew in hushed tones. Alliances were tested. The camaraderie that once defined the force began to fray. Claire refused to let doubt cloud her judgment. She spent sleepless nights reviewing Greg's case files, looking for any hint of a lead. What had drawn him to the warehouse that night? Was it connected to one of his investigations, or was it something personal? The breakthrough came when Claire revisited an old case. A burglary Greg had investigated months earlier. The suspect, a petty criminal named Daryl Finch, had been apprehended near the same warehouse. During questioning, Finch had mentioned seeing unusual activity at the site, but dismissed it as drug deals or teenagers causing trouble. At the time, Greg had brushed it off as irrelevant. Now, with Greg missing, Finch's words took on new significance. Claire tracked down Finch, who was out on parole and reluctant to talk. But under pressure, he admitted to seeing people moving equipment into the warehouse late at night, long after it had been abandoned. It didn't seem like no drug deal, Finch said, fidgeting under Claire's glare. It was too organized, like they were setting something up. Claire's stomach tightened. What had Greg stumbled upon? The deeper she dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Financial records revealed that the warehouse had recently been purchased by a shell corporation with ties to a shadowy network of businesses across state lines. It was a lead, but it raised more questions than answers. As the investigation progressed, tensions within the department reached a breaking point. Some officers resented the scrutiny, while others began to question whether they could trust their colleagues. The chief's insistence on transparency only fueled the paranoia. Claire found herself caught in the middle. Her loyalty to Greg drove her to push harder, but her relentless pursuit of answers made her a target. Whispers about her own involvement began to circulate. "You're taking this too personally, Claire," one officer warned her. Greg was my partner, she snapped. I'm not going to let this case go cold. But as she pieced together the fragments of Greg's last night, Claire began to feel the weight of an uncomfortable truth. The answer she sought might not just expose what happened to Greg. They might reveal secrets the department wasn't ready to face. And someone within their ranks might be willing to do whatever it took to keep those secrets buried. Detective Claire Mason's initial discoveries about the warehouse hinted at something far more complex than a random disappearance. But nothing could prepare her for what came next. Days into the investigation, she uncovered a pattern in Greg Harlan's recent activities that pointed to a covert mission. A mission he hadn't shared with anyone, not even her. Greg had been digging into a trail of irregularities. Missing evidence, tampered case files, and unexplainable financial transactions linked to several senior officers in the Elmswood Police Department. The revelation hit Claire like a punch to the gut. Greg's dedication to his work was well known, but the possibility that he'd been investigating corruption within their own ranks explained why he'd kept his findings so secret. The first break in this new thread of the case came from an unexpected source. A man named Joel Torres, a local journalist with a reputation for chasing dangerous leads, approached Claire outside the department one evening. "I know you're looking for Harlan," Torres began, his voice low, "and I know why he disappeared." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Start talking." Torres revealed that Greg had been feeding him information about a corruption ring within the department. The ring allegedly involved senior officers profiting from falsified reports, seized narcotics that never made it to evidence lockers, and under-the-table deals with powerful local figures. "He was getting too close," Torres said. "He wanted me to run a story, but he was worried it would blow back on him before he had solid proof." Claire's skepticism faded as Torres handed her a USB drive. It contained fragments of reports Greg had collected, financial statements showing unexplained deposits in certain officers' accounts, missing case files from high-profile drug busts, and surveillance footage that hinted at off-the-books meetings. But the evidence was incomplete. Crucial details were missing, and some files were outright corrupted. It was clear someone had tried to destroy the trail Greg had been following. "I told him to be careful," Torres said, his tone grim. "I told him this was bigger than he realized." Back at her desk, Claire combed through the files. Each discovery added another layer to the betrayal. Officers she had trusted, men and women she had shared late nights and hard cases with, were implicated. It was like pulling at a thread, only to find the whole fabric unraveling. The weight of the situation was overwhelming, but Claire pressed on. She needed more than fragments. She needed irrefutable proof. A few days later, an anonymous tip led Claire to a whistleblower within the department. The woman, Officer Marcy Dillon, was a relatively new recruit, nervous and visibly shaken. She met Claire in a secluded park under the cover of darkness. "I don't know who to trust anymore," Marcy admitted, "but I know what's happening isn't right." Marcy revealed that she had stumbled upon a series of destroyed reports and missing files while working overtime in the evidence room. When she questioned a senior officer about it, she was warned to keep her nose out of things if she wanted to keep her job. She handed Claire a folder containing salvaged documents, enough to confirm that the corruption ring was real and deeply entrenched. "What about Greg?" Claire asked. Marcy hesitated. "He came to me a few weeks ago. He knew what was going on and said he was going to expose it, but he seemed scared, like he knew he was running out of time." As the pieces came together, Claire faced a hard truth. Someone inside the department had likely orchestrated Greg's disappearance to protect the corruption ring. But who? The answer came in the form of a chilling discovery. During a surprise locker inspection prompted by Claire's findings, officers uncovered a blood-stained badge belonging to Greg Harlan. It was hidden in the locker of Officer Ray Collins, a seasoned cop with a spotless record and a reputation for unwavering loyalty to the department. The room fell silent as the badge was pulled from the depths of Collins's locker. Chief Avery's face darkened, and murmurs spread like wildfire. Collins protested vehemently. "This is a setup. I didn't do this." But the evidence spoke louder than his words. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department, fracturing the already fragile trust among its members. Claire watched the scene unfold with a sinking feeling. The badge was damning, but it didn't explain everything. Why would Collins, of all people, risk hiding such incriminating evidence in his own locker? As Collins was led away, Claire couldn't shake the suspicion that this was only the beginning. Someone had gone to great lengths to silence Greg Harlan, and now they were using Collins as a scapegoat. The trail of betrayal was far from over. If anything, it was only getting deeper. Story 2. Unsettling Suspect Confessions. The interrogation room was dimly lit, its sterile walls amplifying every creak of a chair and shuffle of papers. Arthur Blake sat at the metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. His expression was unnervingly calm, a small smile playing on his lips as if he were a guest at a dinner party rather than a suspect in a major investigation. Detective Claire Mason leaned against the wall, studying Arthur with the wariness of someone who knew better than to trust appearances. Beside her, Detective Tom Grayson was more openly frustrated, his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on his notepad. "So," Claire began, her voice steady, "you're saying you had something to do with Greg Harlan's disappearance?" Arthur tilted his head, his smile widening. "Oh, I didn't just have something to do with it. I planned it, executed it, every detail. You've been chasing ghosts, detectives. I'm here to set the record straight." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither detective spoke. Claire motioned for Tom to start the recorder, then pulled out her chair and sat across from Arthur. "All right, Mr. Blake," she said, folding her hands on the table. "Let's hear it." Arthur launched into a chillingly vivid account of Greg Harlan's final days. He described stalking Greg, learning his routines, and luring him to the abandoned warehouse. The details were disturbingly precise. The way Greg parked his car slightly crooked when he was in a rush, the worn leather of his holster, even the scuff marks on his boots. "I watched him for weeks," Arthur said, his voice almost reverent. "I knew him better than he knew himself. When the time came, it was almost too easy." Claire maintained her composure, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Arthur's tone was too confident, his descriptions too detailed. Yet something didn't sit right. "How did you lure him to the warehouse?" Claire asked, keeping her voice neutral. Arthur grinned. "A phone call. I told him I had information on a case he'd been working on. Said I was ready to talk, but only if we met in private. He couldn't resist." As the interrogation continued, Arthur's stories grew more convoluted. He claimed responsibility for a string of other crimes, each more horrifying than the last. A series of arson attacks in a neighboring town, the unexplained disappearance of a local journalist, even the cold case murder of a teenage girl nearly a decade ago. The problem was the details didn't match. Dates conflicted, locations were inconsistent, and some of the crimes had already been solved with other suspects convicted. Tom, struggling to hide his irritation, leaned forward. "You're telling us you did all of that? You expect us to believe you're some kind of criminal mastermind?" Arthur's smile faltered for the first time. "Believe what you want. I'm just telling you the truth." But Claire wasn't convinced. Arthur was enjoying this too much, basking in the attention, the power he held over the room. By the third hour of interrogation, it was clear Arthur's confessions were more about self-aggrandizement than truth. The detectives reviewed each claim, only to find themselves chasing dead ends. The arson cases had been committed by a known pyromaniac who was already behind bars. The journalist's disappearance had been ruled an accidental drowning. And the teenage girl's murder? DNA evidence had exonerated the original suspect, but it certainly didn't point to Arthur. "What about Greg?" Claire asked, steering the conversation back to their missing colleague. "You claim you killed him. Where's the body?" Arthur leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "That's for you to figure out, isn't it? But I'll give you a hint. It's closer than you think." Arthur's cryptic statement sent a shiver down Claire's spine. Was he bluffing, or was there some truth buried in his lies? She exchanged a glance with Tom, who gave a slight nod. They needed to dig deeper, but Arthur was clearly relishing the game. As the session stretched into the night, Arthur's demeanor shifted. He grew more erratic, contradicting himself and backtracking on earlier claims. At one point, he described Greg's final moments in excruciating detail, only to later admit he'd made it up for dramatic effect. "You're wasting our time," Tom snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. If you have something real to tell us, now's the time. Arthur shrugged, unbothered by Tom's frustration. I've told you everything you need to know. Whether you believe me is up to you. By the time the interrogation ended, Claire felt no closer to the truth. Arthur Blake had confessed to a dozen crimes, but none of his claims held up under scrutiny. Yet his knowledge of Greg Harlan's habits and routines was too specific to ignore. As she watched Arthur being led back to his cell, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a larger game, one they didn't yet understand. This guy's a lunatic, Tom said, slamming his notepad shut. He's just messing with us. Maybe, Claire replied, her mind racing. Or maybe he knows more than he's letting on. One thing was certain. Arthur Blake was a master manipulator. Whether he was truly involved in Greg's disappearance or just a distraction, he had managed to derail their investigation, wasting precious time and resources. And Claire couldn't help but wonder if that had been his goal all along. The precinct buzzed with frustration as the interrogation room's audio replayed over the speaker in the conference room. Arthur Blake's chilling yet contradictory confessions echoed like a taunt. Detectives crowded around the table, flipping through stacks of notes and case files, their discussions growing more heated with each passing hour. "This guy's wasting our time," Tom Grayson muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "He's a pathological liar, plain and simple." Claire Mason, seated at the head of the table, frowned. "Maybe, but something doesn't add up. He knows too much about Greg's routines to be bluffing entirely. There's a connection we're not seeing." As the senior detectives argued over the next steps, Junior Detective Rachel Lee sat quietly in the corner, her sharp eyes scanning Arthur's timelines. The more she read, the more inconsistencies she noticed. Later that evening, Rachel approached Claire's desk, her notebook clutched tightly. "Detective Mason," she began, her voice steady but urgent. "I think I've found something." Claire looked up, gesturing for Rachel to sit. "Go on." Rachel flipped open her notebook, revealing a detailed chart of Arthur's supposed timeline. His claims don't match up with known events. Take the arson cases he confessed to. The fires were set 2 days apart in towns 50 miles away. There's no way he could have traveled between them and left undetected. Claire leaned closer, studying the notes. And Greg's disappearance? Rachel hesitated. Arthur's story about the phone call doesn't make sense either. Greg never mentioned getting a tip-off to meet someone, and his phone records don't show any unusual calls that night. Claire's brows furrowed. "So, why confess at all?" "That's what's bothering me," Rachel admitted. "It feels like he wants us to focus on him, like he's a decoy." The breakthrough came the next morning. Rachel dug into Arthur's background and discovered a surprising connection. He had been a confidential informant for one of the department's senior officers, Captain James Rourke, several years ago. What was Rourke doing with someone like Arthur? Claire asked, her voice low as she and Rachel reviewed the findings in her office. Rachel shrugged. Arthur's record shows he was involved in low-level crimes, drug deals, petty theft. Maybe Rourke used him for intel. But here's the thing. All the cases Arthur worked on with Rourke were quietly closed, with minimal documentation. It's like someone wanted to erase the trail. Claire's jaw tightened. Rourke's been vocal about wanting this investigation to wrap up quickly. Too vocal. If Arthur's here to mislead us, it might be on his orders. That afternoon, Arthur was brought back into the interrogation room. This time, Claire and Rachel took the lead. "Back so soon?" Arthur quipped, his smug grin returning. "We have a few more questions," Claire said coolly, taking a seat across from him. "About your relationship with Captain Rourke." Arthur's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Rachel interjected, her tone sharper than usual. "You work for him. We know about the cases you helped close. So tell us, did he send you here to waste our time?" Arthur leaned back in his chair, the smugness returning. "You're barking up the wrong tree, ladies. Rourke and I haven't spoken in years." "Funny," Claire said, sliding a folder across the table. "Because we found records of a phone call between the two of you just a week before Greg disappeared." Arthur's mask of confidence cracked, his jaw tightening. "You've got nothing," he muttered. Claire leaned forward, her voice low and dangerous. "You think this is a game, Arthur? Greg Harlan is missing. Maybe dead, And if you had anything to do with it, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life rotting in a cell. Arthur's eyes darted between Claire and Rachel, his bravado slipping. Finally, he exhaled sharply and muttered, "You're looking for ghosts when the real monsters are right in front of you." The room fell silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. Claire stared at him, her mind racing. Was this another of Arthur's manipulations, or a genuine warning? Who are the monsters? Rachel pressed, her voice firm. Arthur smirked, leaning forward. "Oh, you'll find out. But by the time you do, it might be too late." With that, he sat back, refusing to say another word. As Arthur was escorted back to his cell, Claire turned to Rachel, her expression grim. "He knows something, and if Rourke's involved, this goes deeper than we thought." Rachel nodded, her determination matching Claire's. "Then we'll uncover it, whatever it takes." But deep down, both women knew they were up against forces far more dangerous than a manipulative suspect. The trap had been set, and they were walking straight into it. Story 3. The Mystery of Disappearing Evidence. It had been weeks since Greg Harlan's disappearance, and yet the case seemed to slip further into the shadows of uncertainty. What was once a straightforward investigation had now become a web of contradictions, obfuscations, and unexplainable events. The department that once stood united in its pursuit of truth was now fracturing under the weight of suspicion and internal turmoil. Detective Claire Mason was seated at her desk late into the night, scanning through the latest batch of forensic reports. Her eyes narrowed as she sifted through the files. One by one, pieces of vital evidence seemed to have vanished from the records: surveillance footage from the night Greg disappeared, witness statements that had never made it to the official case files, and crucial forensic reports that had been inexplicably redacted or missing altogether. It was as if someone or something was deliberately erasing any trace of the truth. "Something's wrong," Claire muttered to herself, her fingers pressing hard against the desk. She picked up the phone and dialed Rachel's number. The next morning, the two detectives met in the precinct's back office. Rachel sat across from Claire, her brow furrowed in thought as she reviewed the same set of files. "It's like someone's playing a game with us," Rachel said, shaking her head. "But who would have access to this level of information? That's the question, isn't it?" Claire replied, her voice heavy with frustration. "We've checked every angle, every lead, every suspect. But now, critical pieces of evidence are just disappearing." She paused, her gaze flicking to the door as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. "We need to get to the bottom of this. Fast." Rachel nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. "If there's a leak, we have to find it. We can't afford to keep chasing ghosts." The two detectives had barely begun to discuss their next steps when the door swung open. Lieutenant Mark Hughes stepped in, his face tight and grim. He was one of the senior officers in the department, known for his no-nonsense attitude, but today his expression was strained. "We have a problem," Hughes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Internal Affairs is stepping in." Claire and Rachel exchanged uneasy glances. "Internal Affairs?" Claire asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into her voice. "Why?" Hughes's lips tightened into a thin line. "Evidence has gone missing, highly sensitive stuff, and it's all tied to Greg's case. They want to know who's responsible, and they'll stop at nothing to find out." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Internal Affairs, with their relentless probing and suspicion, would only add more pressure to an already volatile situation. "We'll find out who's behind this," Claire said, determination filling her voice. "We won't let anyone sweep this under the rug." Hughes hesitated before nodding. "I hope so, Mason, but you need to be careful. The department's already on edge. This could tear us apart if we're not careful." The tension in the precinct was palpable as Internal Affairs descended on the station. Officers avoided eye contact, their conversations turning to whispers whenever anyone walked by. Every room fell under scrutiny, every decision made with an eye on the future. No one was immune from suspicion. Rachel stood in the hallway, watching as IA agents combed through the evidence locker. The unsettling silence made her skin crawl. As she watched them, a thought nagged at the back of her mind. Could someone in the department be actively sabotaging the investigation? Before she could follow the thought further, the door to Captain Rourke's office swung open. A figure stepped out, Detective Arnold Webb, a veteran officer known for his quiet demeanor and sharp instincts. His face was ashen, and his eyes were shadowed with something deeper than exhaustion. Rachel approached him cautiously. "Webb, everything okay?" Webb shook his head, his gaze distant. "I'm done," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'm stepping down." Rachel blinked, surprised. "What? You're resigning? Why?" "Burnout," Webb replied with a hollow laugh, his voice laced with bitterness. "It's a mess in there. I can't do this anymore." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Arnold Webb had been with the department for over 20 years, and the idea of him resigning so suddenly felt off. "You sure there's nothing more to it?" Webb hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the door of the Internal Affairs office. "Listen, Mason, you're a good cop, but this case, this department, I don't know who to trust anymore. I've seen enough to know when it's time to get out." With that, he walked away, leaving Rachel to stand in the hallway, her mind racing with unanswered questions. As the day wore on, the atmosphere at the precinct grew more oppressive. Detectives moved with a sense of unease, their glances more guarded. In the locker room, Claire found herself standing face to face with Captain Rourke, who was carefully polishing his badge, his demeanor as calm as ever. "You're awfully quiet today, Captain," Claire remarked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Anything on your mind?" Rourke looked up, his expression inscrutable. "I'm just trying to stay out of the line of fire, Mason. Internal Affairs doesn't play games, and we're all under their microscope now." His words were careful, measured, but Claire didn't miss the flicker of something in his eyes. Something darker, something guarded. "This is bigger than we thought," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Rourke's gaze hardened. "Just focus on your work, Mason. There's nothing to see here." Later that evening, Claire sat at her desk, reviewing the evidence once again. Her mind was still spinning from the strange resignation of Webb and the unsettling presence of Internal Affairs. She could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. The department was fracturing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was orchestrating it all from the shadows. As she flipped through the last of the reports, one sentence stood out like a beacon in the storm. "Evidence of foul play in Officer Harlan's disappearance has been deliberately destroyed, with deliberate care taken to conceal the trail." Her heart skipped a beat. Someone was intentionally obstructing justice. But who? And why? She picked up the phone and dialed Rachel's number. When her partner answered, Claire spoke quickly, urgency in her voice. "We got a leak, Rachel. Someone inside is covering their tracks. And if we don't figure out who it is soon, we might lose everything." Rachel's voice was tight. "I'm with you, Claire. Let's finish this before it's too late." In the shadowed corners of the precinct, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to shift into place. Claire and Rachel knew they were on the brink of something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The mystery of the disappearing evidence was only the tip of the iceberg. But with each passing day, the walls around them grew higher, and the trust they once had in their own department continued to erode. The game had changed, and no one was safe. The days following Arnold Webb's resignation grew darker, and Claire and Rachel found themselves mired deeper in the unsettling chaos of the department. The investigation into Greg Harlan's disappearance had entered a treacherous phase, with every lead seeming to circle back to an insurmountable wall of secrecy. But in the midst of their mounting frustrations, an unexpected breakthrough arrived in the form of a tip: a journalist named Emily Rhodes. Emily had been covering local crime for years, and despite the public trust in the police, she had long been suspicious of the murky undercurrents flowing within the department. Over a cup of coffee, she leaned across the table, her eyes scanning the room cautiously before speaking in hushed tones. "I've got something for you," she began, her voice heavy with urgency. "A source close to the investigation reached out to me. It's about Greg. You won't believe what he uncovered before he disappeared." Rachel leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" Emily's face was grim. "A trafficking ring. Local criminals, but not just them, complicit officers within your department. I've been digging into Greg's last known activities, and everything points to a much larger operation than anyone knows. It's being covered up, and Greg was getting too close. The words hit Claire and Rachel like a punch to the gut. How could they not have seen it? The missing pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to align. The next morning, Claire and Rachel met in the dimly lit conference room at the precinct. They laid out the new information, Emily's leak, on the table between them. Greg had been following a trail that led to something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The department's integrity was compromised from the inside, and it was clear now that Greg had been silenced for knowing too much. But who was involved, and who had the motive to erase him from the picture? "I never thought it would be this deep," Rachel said, her voice strained. "We always thought of Greg as just a good cop, but now it looks like he was digging into something he shouldn't have." Claire nodded, her mind racing. It wasn't just about the disappearance anymore. It's about corruption, about people we trusted turning against us. But as much as they wanted to chase this new revelation, they knew they had to tread carefully. If this trafficking ring was as vast as Emily suggested, they would need more than just a hunch to bring it to light. They needed evidence. Rachel reached in her bag and pulled out a file she'd been keeping close to her chest. "There's more," she said, opening it to reveal a series of photographs. "I found something." These were hidden in Greg's personal effects. It's a journal. His handwriting is barely legible, but there's enough here to piece it together. Claire skimmed through the journal's pages. Greg had documented everything. Meetings with informants, strange transactions, and most chilling of all, names of officers who had been in too deep with local criminals. It was a trail that led directly to the heart of the department. And buried within the pages was the name of someone Claire never expected. Officer Sean Mitchell. Mitchell had been Greg's closest partner. The two had shared cases, laughed together over lunch, and trusted each other implicitly. The thought that Mitchell might be involved in Greg's disappearance was a bitter pill to swallow. But the journal didn't lie. "Mitchell," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's the one who did this." The investigation quickly shifted focus, and within days, the detectives had compiled enough evidence to confront Sean Mitchell. The weight of it was overwhelming. Surveillance footage showing Mitchell meeting with known criminals, text messages between him and corrupt officers, and the damning journal entries that outlined Greg's suspicions. They had him cornered now, but Claire knew they had to be careful. Mitchell was a seasoned officer, a man with years of experience covering his tracks. If they pressed him too hard, he might slip away again. They needed to be patient. Every move had to be calculated. As the interrogation room door closed behind them, Claire and Rachel exchanged one final glance before sitting down across from Mitchell. The officer sat stiffly, his hands folded in front of him. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes darted between the two detectives. It was clear he knew why they were there. "You don't have to do this, Sean," Rachel began, her voice calm but firm. "We know what you've done. We know you've been hiding something big, and we know you're involved in Greg's disappearance." Mitchell didn't flinch. He just stared at the table, his face impassive. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the edge of his voice betrayed him. Claire leaned forward, her gaze steady. "We have the evidence, Sean. Your connections, the money trails, the photographs. You thought you could get away with it, but we've uncovered everything. You can't run anymore." For a long moment, Mitchell sat in silence. His breath came shallow, his mind clearly racing. Then, as if resigning to his fate, he looked up at Claire, his eyes hollow with guilt. "It was never supposed to go this far," Mitchell admitted, his voice cracked. "I didn't think Greg would get involved. He was supposed to stay in the dark. But once he started asking questions, once he got too close, I didn't have a choice." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. "You killed him." Mitchell's eyes flickered with shame. "No, I didn't kill him, but I was the one who set it all in motion. I made sure he couldn't expose us. I convinced myself that it was for the greater good, that no one would ever find out. But now look at us. It's all falling apart." Rachel's hand tightened into a fist, barely contained anger rippling beneath the surface. "So, you thought silencing him was the only way? You destroyed his life. Our lives for money, power, and protection from a system you knew was corrupt." Mitchell nodded slowly, tears threatening to spill. "I didn't want it to go this way, but I was already in too deep. and now I'm going to pay for it. The confession was damning, but it wasn't the end. The truth about Greg Harlan's disappearance, about the corruption within the department, had been exposed. Yet, there was still a lingering question in the air. How many others were involved? Mitchell had been the one to pull the strings, but he was only a cog in a much larger machine. As the detectives left the interrogation room, the weight of the revelation hung heavy on their shoulders. The department was in turmoil, and the public trust had been shattered. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but the full scope of the corruption was far from clear. The ghosts of Greg Harlan's investigation would continue to haunt them until every last secret was brought into the light. And the truth, Claire knew, was only the beginning. The courtroom was filled with the quiet hum of tension as Sean Mitchell was led away in handcuffs, his once proud bearing shattered, a stark contrast to the man who had walked in so many years before. The case that had started with the mysterious disappearance of Officer Greg Harlan had spiraled into a devastating expose of corruption that reached deep into the heart of the department. Mitchell's conviction was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. His confession, the photographs, the journal, and the testimony of those who had known the dark secrets of the trafficking ring. The network that had been operating under the cover of law enforcement had been brought to light, and its members were now being arrested one by one. The criminals they had been protecting, local and beyond, faced the full force of the law. The department, once a pillar of the community, underwent a massive restructuring. Officers who had been implicated in the scandal were suspended or dismissed. New leadership was brought in to restore trust, though some wounds would never fully heal. It wasn't just the officers who had betrayed their oaths. Whole systems had failed. And though the department could rebuild, the damage to its reputation was irreversible. Greg Harlan, who had given everything to his job, was cleared posthumously. The press covered his story extensively, revealing the bravery he had shown in his final days as he attempted to expose a criminal empire that spanned far beyond the reach of the law. A memorial was erected in his honor, a simple yet powerful gesture. But it was a reminder that no medal, no accolade could ever bring him back. The town that had once whispered about his disappearance now spoke his name with reverence. He had been a hero, though his heroism had cost him everything. Now retired, the former detective sat in his quiet home, the once bustling precinct a distant memory. Time had softened the sharp edges of his grief, but it had not erased the weight of the years that had followed. The case of Greg Harlan had changed him in ways he could never quite explain. There was a bitterness that lingered in his heart, a bitter truth that had become all too clear over the years. We lost more than Greg that day, he thought as he looked out at the view of the small town below. The reflection of the setting sun gleamed off the streets where the town's people now walked freely, unaware of the darkness that had once simmered beneath their feet. We lost our innocence, our trust, but maybe, just maybe, we found our truth. The world of policing, once full of hope and idealism, had shattered in the wake of the corruption scandal. Loyalty and integrity had become distant ideals, eroded by the compromises made in the pursuit of power and personal gain. It wasn't just the officers who had failed, but the entire system. The trust between the community and its protectors had been destroyed. He had learned, over the years, that justice was not always as clean and simple as it appeared. The lines between right and wrong, loyalty and integrity, had become increasingly blurry. He had been taught to believe that the truth would always come out, that good would ultimately triumph. But in this case, truth had been a long and painful road. It had cost Greg Harlan his life, it had broken the department, and it had left everyone who had been part of the investigation scarred. The narrator's thoughts turned to the detectives who had worked beside him, those who had stood with him through the darkest moments of the investigation. They too had been shaped by the events. They had all learned the same lesson, that sometimes the price of justice was not just measured in time, or money, or effort. It was measured in the loss of everything you thought you knew about the world. As the years passed, the department continued its work to restore itself. Some of the officers who had remained had worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the community, though they often found themselves facing public scrutiny and internal doubts. And yet, they pressed on, driven by a renewed sense of duty to uphold the law and, perhaps more importantly, to redeem the legacy of their fallen colleague. But the narrator knew the truth, that some things could never be fully redeemed. The scars, the betrayals, and the broken trust would always remain. The case of Greg Harlan had been a turning point, not just for the department, but for everyone involved. The narrative ended with a simple, unspoken truth, one that hung in the air like the bitter cold of a winter's night. We lost more than Greg that day. We lost our innocence, our trust. But maybe, just maybe, we found our truth. The truth had been buried beneath the layers of betrayal, deception, and corruption. But it had surfaced in the end. It had come at a cost, a terrible cost, but it was the only way forward. The department would rebuild, but the memories of Greg's sacrifice would never fade. And for those who had lived through it all, the cost of justice would remain forever etched in their souls.